The small town of Clearwater lay quiet under a blanket of stars, the streets empty except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the cool night breeze. Sheriff Jack Wilkins sat behind the wheel of his cruiser, a half-empty cup of coffee resting in the holder. At 53, Jack had come to prefer these late-night shifts, where the silence of the town matched the emptiness he felt inside. For him, the night was a refuge from the memories that haunted him during the day. His eyes drifted briefly to the worn photograph taped to the dashboard, showing his wife Laura and his daughter Emily. They both smiled back at him, frozen in time, a cruel reminder of the life he'd lost 7 years ago in a car accident that had taken them away from him. Jack quickly looked away, focusing on the road ahead. Grief had shaped him into a man of routines, and patrols gave him something to fill the void. Clearwater was no more than a dot on the map, a town where crime was almost non-existent. It was a town that asked little of its sheriff beyond his presence. As Jack drove the empty streets, his headlights washed over the 24-hour laundromat at the corner of Maple and Fifth. It wasn't a place that stood out, but tonight something caught his attention. A small figure inside, barely visible through the glass windows. He slowed the cruiser and squinted. A young girl. She was alone. Jack felt his instincts as a sheriff kick in. What was a child doing alone in a laundromat at this hour? The girl couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, her small frame nearly swallowed by a faded jacket that was much too big for her. She was folding clothes, carefully placing them in a plastic bag, her movements slow and deliberate. Jack thought about getting out of the car, but then he stopped. She must be waiting for a parent, he told himself. Perhaps someone was nearby, just out of sight, maybe running a late errand. It wasn't uncommon in a town like Clearwater, where people tended to leave their doors unlocked and trust their neighbors. But as Jack drove away, the image of the little girl alone in the fluorescent light stayed with him, nagging at him in the back of his mind. The next night was much the same quiet streets, the same emptiness. But as Jack made his rounds, something pulled him back toward the laundromat. He slowed the cruiser as he passed, peering through the windows. There she was again, the same little girl, folding clothes in the dead of night, all alone. This time, Jack's curiosity mixed with concern. Why was she there again? Was this her routine? He made a mental note to pass by the laundromat again later that night, hoping to see if someone else would show up, but no one came. On the third night, when Jack saw the girl for the third time, the questions in his mind began to multiply. Where are her parents? Why is she doing laundry alone at such an hour? This wasn't a coincidence anymore, and his gut told him something was wrong. The little girl worked methodically, folding clothes with the care of someone much older, her small hands deftly smoothing out each garment before placing it neatly in the bag beside her. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unusual about the situation. His cop instincts were ringing alarms, but there was something else, something more personal. A part of him, deep down, felt connected to her loneliness. Hadn't he felt that same emptiness, that same weight of isolation? On the fourth night, Jack made a decision. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to know what was going on. He parked the cruiser across the street from the laundromat, watching as the girl moved through her usual routine. His heart tightened. She looked so small, so fragile, dwarfed by the machines that whirred around her. Taking a deep breath, Jack stepped out of the cruiser and made his way to the entrance. The bell above the door chimed softly as he walked in, and the girl glanced up for a brief moment before quickly looking back down at the clothes in her hands. Her face was expressionless, her body tense as if she were bracing for something. "Hey there," Jack said softly, keeping his voice calm. "You okay?" The girl didn't respond, her fingers tightening around the t-shirt she was folding. Jack crouched down to her level, careful not to startle her. Up close, he could see the wear on her jacket, the frayed cuffs, the scuffed shoes. "I'm Sheriff Wilkins," he said, tapping the badge on his chest. "What's your name?" For a moment, the girl froze, her eyes flicking toward the door as if she were considering running, but she didn't move. "It's okay," Jack said gently. "I just want to make sure you're all right." The girl finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Kayla," Jack repeated, smiling softly. "Are you here by yourself?" Kayla nodded, her eyes still downcast. Jack frowned. This wasn't right. A child her age shouldn't be doing laundry alone in the middle of the night. He scanned the laundromat, looking for any sign of an adult, but the place was empty except for the hum of the machines. Is your mom or dad coming to pick you up? Jack asked carefully. Kayla shook her head. No. Jack's concern deepened. He wanted to press further, to ask her where she lived, why she was out so late. But something stopped him. The fear in her eyes, the way her small body seemed to curl in on itself. It reminded him of Emily, his own daughter, when she was scared of thunderstorms. He didn't want to frighten her. Just as Jack was about to speak again, the door chimed, and a woman walked in carrying a basket of laundry. She looked over at Kayla, her expression neutral. There you are, Kayla, the woman said. You ready to go? Kayla nodded, quickly gathering her things. Jack stood up, watching the exchange closely. Was this her mother? The woman didn't seem particularly affectionate toward Kayla, but she didn't seem threatening either. Is everything all right here? Jack asked the woman. She smiled politely. Everything's fine, Sheriff. Just finishing up some laundry. Jack nodded, though unease gnawed at him. Something about this situation didn't sit right with him. As Kayla and the woman walked out of the laundromat, Jack felt a sense of dread wash over him. This isn't over, he thought to himself. There's more to this story. The next day, Sheriff Jack Wilkins couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong with the little girl, Kayla, who kept appearing at the laundromat. As he sat in his office staring at the report on his desk, his mind kept drifting back to her small, quiet form and the unease that had taken root in his chest. He tapped his pen against the desk, trying to focus, but it was no use. After his encounter with her the night before, he had hoped to see some resolution, some adult stepping forward to explain why Kayla was out alone night after night. But the woman who had picked her up gave him no peace of mind. There was something cold about her, something distant, in the way Kayla had barely spoken, the fear in her eyes. It reminded him too much of the vulnerable children he'd seen in his years as a cop. He needed to know more. Jack picked up the phone and dialed the local school district office. After a few rings, a cheery voice answered. Clearwater Unified, how can I help you? Hi, this is Sheriff Wilkins, Jack said. I'm looking for information on a student. Her name is Kayla Henderson, about 8 or 9 years old. She lives here in town. There was a pause on the other end. One moment, Sheriff. Jack waited, the tension building in his chest. How hard could it be to find information on a young girl in a small town? After a few minutes, the woman returned. I'm sorry, Sheriff, but we don't have any record of a Kayla Henderson attending any of the schools in our district. Jack frowned. Are you sure? Could she be under a different name? I've checked all variations. There's no Kayla Henderson or anyone matching that age and description. Jack thanked her and hung up, a sense of dread creeping up his spine. No school records? That doesn't make sense. He pushed back from his desk and grabbed his jacket. Something wasn't right, and he wasn't going to rest until he found out what it was. That night, Jack drove his usual patrol route, but this time he made a point to pass by the laundromat more than once. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, he spotted Kayla through the laundromat windows, just like before, methodically folding her clothes. She was alone again, and this time there was no sign of the woman who had picked her up. Jack's gut twisted. He couldn't keep ignoring this. Pulling the cruiser to a stop across the street, he decided to wait and see if anyone came for her. As the minutes stretched into hours, no one did. The laundromat slowly emptied until it was just Kayla, sitting quietly on the bench with her small bag of clothes by her side. Finally, Jack stepped out of the cruiser and crossed the street. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Kayla looked up, her expression a mix of surprise and apprehension. Hey, Kayla, Jack said softly, kneeling down beside her. It's late. Where's your mom? Kayla's eyes darted to the floor. She's busy, she murmured. Jack frowned. Busy? She's not coming to get you? Kayla shook her head, hugging the bag of clothes to her chest. Jack felt a pang of concern twist inside him. This isn't just a kid helping with chores. This is something else entirely. Kayla, Jack began gently. Where do you live? Kayla didn't answer. Instead, she stood up suddenly, grabbing her bag and heading for the door. Wait, Jack called after her, but she was already gone, disappearing into the darkness outside. Jack stood there, his heart pounding. Why is she running? What is she hiding? He wasn't sure what he had just witnessed, but it felt very wrong. The next few days, Jack couldn't let the situation go. Every time he drove by the laundromat, he looked for Kayla. His concern grew as he spoke with people around town, especially those who frequented the laundromat or lived nearby. One night, as he stopped at the local diner for coffee, he overheard two women talking in hushed tones at the counter. They didn't notice him, but their conversation was unmistakably about Kayla. "That little girl again," one of them whispered. "Always there, late at night, no one around to watch her. It's not right." "I know," the other woman replied. "It gives me the chills. A child that young, all by herself like that? Someone ought to call social services." Jack's grip on his coffee mug tightened. It wasn't just him. Other people were noticing too. The town was starting to talk. But why hadn't anyone done anything about it yet? He couldn't shake the feeling that if he didn't act, no one would. Determined to figure out what was going on, Jack decided to take matters into his own hands. That night, he positioned himself in his cruiser a block away from the laundromat, far enough to remain unseen but close enough to keep an eye on Kayla. He had to know where she was going, and more importantly, where she was coming from. At just before midnight, as expected, Kayla appeared from around the corner, her small frame barely visible in the dim light of the street lamps. She slipped inside the laundromat, and Jack waited, watching closely. Hours passed, and no one came to pick her up. Finally, as the last hour of the night ticked by, Jack saw Kayla leave the laundromat, the small bag of clothes clutched tightly in her arms. She glanced nervously over her shoulder before turning down an alleyway behind the building. Jack's heart raced. Where is she going at this hour? Quietly, he followed her, staying far enough back to remain undetected. The alley led to the edge of town, past darkened storefronts and abandoned lots, until they reached a small, rundown building, an old boarding house long forgotten by most of Clearwater. Kayla slipped through a broken side door, disappearing inside. Jack stood in the shadows, his mind racing. She's living here? All alone? He wanted to follow her, to make sure she was safe, but something stopped him. This was bigger than he'd thought. He couldn't just barge in and scare her. He needed to approach this carefully, with a plan. The next day, Jack sat at his desk, frustration gnawing at him. He had tried talking to Kayla, tried getting her to open up, but it wasn't enough. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces missing. He needed more information, and he needed it fast. He decided to visit Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who lived in the apartment above the laundromat. She had been a longtime resident of Clearwater and knew more about the town's comings and goings than anyone else. When Jack knocked on her door, Mrs. Johnson greeted him with a warm smile. "Sheriff Wilkins, what brings you by?" "Mrs. Johnson," Jack said, "I'm looking into something, and I could use your help. Have you noticed a little girl at the laundromat lately?" "Late at night?" Mrs. Johnson's smile faded. "Oh, that poor little thing," she said, shaking her head. "I see her all the time. Looks so tired, bless her heart. I offered her a cookie once, but she just shook her head and kept folding clothes. It's not right, Sheriff. A child her age should be home in bed, not wandering around at midnight." Jack's stomach tightened. "Do you know anything about her? Who she's with? Where she lives?" Mrs. Johnson frowned. "No, I don't. But I've never seen her with anyone. Always alone." Jack thanked her and left, his mind racing. Kayla wasn't just in trouble, she was in danger. The next evening, Sheriff Jack Wilkins found himself parked outside the laundromat again, his mind swirling with thoughts of Kayla. He had spent the day researching the abandoned boarding house and talking to a few more residents, but none of them knew much about it. It had been empty for years, falling into disrepair, and no one had any idea a child was living there. Jack felt a knot in his chest tighten. How long had she been there, all alone? It was just past midnight when he saw Kayla slip into the laundromat again, carrying her small bag of clothes. Jack took a deep breath. Tonight, he would get answers. He stepped out of his cruiser and walked across the street, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Kayla looked up, her eyes wide with fear. She froze, her small hands clutching the fabric she was folding, and for a moment, the two of them just stood there in silence. "Kayla," Jack said softly, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." Kayla didn't move. She looked down at the floor, her body tense as if ready to bolt. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jack continued, kneeling down to her level. "I just want to make sure you're okay." Kayla shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, you're not," Jack said gently. "You've been here alone night after night. I know you're scared, but I need to know what's going on. Where are your parents, Kayla? Who's taking care of you?" Kayla's lower lip trembled, and for a moment Jack thought she was going to cry. But instead she looked away, her shoulders shaking as she held back sobs. "They're gone," she whispered. "My mom, she got sick. She didn't wake up." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. Gone? Her mother was dead? He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it from Kayla's own mouth made his heart ache. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Kayla," he said softly. "But what about your dad or other family? Is there anyone who can help you?" Kayla shook her head again, her voice a broken whisper. "There's no one. It was just me and my mom." Jack's heart tightened. This little girl had been all alone for who knows how long, struggling to survive without anyone to care for her. He could see it now, the oversized jacket, the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she flinched at the slightest sound. She was afraid, and she had every reason to be. "How long have you been on your own?" Jack asked, his voice thick with emotion. Kayla shrugged, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "A long time." Jack let out a long breath, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. A child her age, fending for herself in an abandoned building, no family, no safety. This wasn't just neglect. This was survival. Jack knew he had to act, but he didn't want to scare Kayla. He needed to gain her trust, to show her that he wasn't just another adult who would let her down. He had already failed to save his own daughter. He couldn't fail Kayla, too. "Kayla," Jack said carefully, "you don't have to keep doing this on your own. I can help you. I want to help you." Kayla looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Why?" she asked, her voice small and hesitant. "Why do you care?" Jack paused, the question catching him off guard. But then, as he looked at her, he knew exactly why. Because she reminded him of Emily. Because he couldn't save his own family. But maybe he could save Kayla. "Because no one should have to go through what you're going through," Jack said softly, "especially not a kid. And because I lost someone too, my daughter." Her name was Emily. Kayla's eyes widened, and for the first time Jack saw a flicker of understanding in her gaze. "If Emily were in trouble," Jack continued, his voice thick with emotion, "I'd want someone to help her, and I think your mom would want the same for you." For a long moment, Kayla was silent, her small hands twisting the fabric of her jacket. Then slowly she nodded. She whispered, "But I don't want to go to foster care. I'm scared." Jack's heart ached at the fear in her voice. He couldn't blame her. The system wasn't always kind to kids like Kayla, and he didn't want to hand her over to an uncertain fate. But he also knew he couldn't just leave her in that abandoned building. "We'll figure something out," Jack promised, "but you can't stay in that place anymore. You deserve better than that." Kayla didn't respond, but the way she looked at him, the glimmer of hope in her eyes, was enough for Jack to know he was on the right path. The next morning, Jack sat at his desk, his mind racing with thoughts of Kayla. She had agreed to stay at the station for the night, but he knew it was only a temporary solution. He needed to find a more permanent arrangement, and fast. Jack picked up the phone and dialed social services. After a few rings, a woman's voice answered. "Clearwater Child Protective Services, this is Monica Thompson speaking. How can I help you?" "Monica, this is Sheriff Wilkins," Jack said, leaning back in his chair. "I've got a situation here, and I could use your help." He explained everything, Kayla's situation, her mother's death, and how she had been living on her own for months. Monica listened quietly, her voice calm but firm when she finally spoke. "This is serious, Sheriff," Monica said. "We need to get her into protective care immediately. It's not safe for her to stay on the streets." Jack sighed. "I know, but she's scared of going into the system. She's already been through so much, and I don't want to traumatize her even more." There was a pause on the other end. "I understand," Monica said softly, "but we have protocols in place for a reason. Children in her situation need stability, structure, and support." "I agree," Jack said, But I'm wondering, is there any way we can keep her close? She trusts me. If we throw her into foster care without a plan, I'm afraid she'll run. Monica was silent for a moment, and Jack could hear the sound of papers shuffling on her end. There might be a way, she said finally. It's not typical, but given your position and the circumstance, you could apply for temporary guardianship while we work on a more permanent solution. Jack sat up straighter in his chair. Temporary guardianship? What does that involve? It's a legal process, Monica explained. You'd be responsible for her well-being until a long-term placement is found. It would give Kayla some stability while we figure out the next steps. But it's a big commitment, Sheriff. Are you sure you're ready for that? Jack didn't hesitate. I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe. Later that afternoon, Jack returned to the station, where Kayla was sitting quietly in the small break room, her legs swinging back and forth as she stared out the window. She looked so small, so lost in the oversized chair, and Jack felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him. He sat down across from her, his voice gentle but firm. Kayla, we need to talk about what happens next. Kayla turned to him, her eyes wide with worry. Are you sending me away? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack shook his head. Not if you don't want me to, but we need to figure out where you're going to stay. I talked to someone from social services, and there's an option that might work for both of us. Kayla stared at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? Jack took a deep breath. I can apply to be your temporary guardian. That means you'd stay with me for a while, until we figure out something more permanent. You wouldn't have to go into foster care, and you'd be safe. Kayla's eyes widened. I'd stay with you? Really? Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. If you're okay with that. For a moment, Kayla didn't say anything. She just stared at Jack, her dark eyes searching his face as if trying to figure out if he was serious. You mean it? She asked quietly. You won't leave me? Jack's heart clenched at the vulnerability in her voice. He leaned forward, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. I promise, Kayla. I'm not going anywhere. Kayla looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the fabric of her jacket. Then slowly she nodded. Okay, she whispered. I'll stay with you. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as Jack worked with Monica and the legal team to get the guardianship paperwork in order. There were background checks, home visits, and interviews to attend, but Jack didn't mind. He was determined to make sure Kayla had a safe place to call home, even if it was temporary. As the days passed, Jack and Kayla began to settle into a routine. She moved into the small guest room in Jack's house, and while she was still quiet and reserved, Jack could see glimpses of her beginning to trust him. They ate breakfast together in the mornings, and at night Jack would read to her from the old storybooks that had once belonged to Emily. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when Kayla would retreat into herself, her fear and uncertainty bubbling to the surface. But each day, Jack could see her growing stronger, more confident. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just patrolling empty streets anymore. He was protecting someone who needed him, someone who had given him a reason to keep going. The first week after Kayla moved in with Jack was filled with quiet, tentative adjustments. Jack kept his distance at first, not wanting to overwhelm her. Kayla was still shy, still unsure of her new environment. She would sit quietly at the kitchen table, her eyes darting around as if she was trying to figure out if this was real, if she could actually relax here. For Jack, the shift in his life was both jarring and welcome. After years of going through the motions, his home now had an occupant besides himself, a child who needed him. It was strange having someone else in the house. The long hours of silence were now filled with the quiet sounds of Kayla moving around, the soft padding of her feet on the floor, and the rustle of pages when she flipped through the books he gave her. But despite the presence of this new life, something was off. Jack could sense the emotional walls Kayla had built around herself, and no matter how gentle or patient he tried to be, those walls remained firmly in place. One night, a few days after Kayla moved in, Jack awoke to the sound of soft crying. He sat up in bed, listening carefully. It was coming from Kayla's room. He quietly walked down the hall and stopped at her door. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he could see her small form curled up on the bed, her face buried in her pillow as she cried softly to herself. Jack hesitated. He didn't want to intrude, but the sound of her sobs tugged at his heart. Gently, he knocked on the door. "Kayla?" She didn't respond, but her crying grew quieter, as if she were trying to hide it from him. Jack stepped into the room, keeping his voice soft. "Hey, you okay?" Kayla sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm fine," she murmured, though the quiver in her voice gave her away. Jack sat down on the edge of the bed, careful to give her space. "You want to talk about it?" For a moment, Kayla didn't answer. She just stared at the wall, her small body tense. But then in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I'm scared." Jack felt his heart clench. "What are you scared of?" Kayla hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "That you'll change your mind, that I'll have to leave." Jack's chest tightened. He had seen this fear in her eyes before, the fear of abandonment, of being unwanted, and it made sense. After everything she had been through, why wouldn't she believe that? But hearing her say it out loud still broke his heart. "I'm not going to change my mind, Kayla," Jack said softly. "You're not going anywhere." "I promise." Kayla looked at him, her dark eyes filled with doubt. "How do you know?" she asked. "What if they come and take me away?" Jack's throat tightened. He didn't have an easy answer to that. Legally, they were still in limbo, waiting for the courts to process the guardianship paperwork. And Kayla was right. There was always a chance that the system might send her somewhere else. But Jack wasn't going to let that happen. "I'll do everything I can to make sure you stay here," Jack said, his voice steady. "You belong here now. This is your home." Kayla didn't say anything, but the way she looked at him, the small flicker of hope in her eyes, told Jack that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to believe him. As the days passed, Jack found himself struggling with his own doubts. Kayla was settling in, slowly opening up to him, but the responsibility of caring for her weighed heavily on his shoulders. What if he wasn't enough? What if he couldn't give her the life she deserved? He wasn't a father anymore, not since Emily. Could he really be the kind of parent Kayla needed? One evening, after Kayla had gone to bed, Jack sat on the porch, staring out at the quiet street. The weight of his thoughts pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He had taken on this responsibility because he couldn't stand the thought of Kayla being alone. But what if he was doing more harm than good? As he sat there, lost in thought, the phone rang inside the house. Jack stood up and walked back inside, picking up the receiver. "Sheriff Wilkins?" came the familiar voice of Monica Thompson from Social Services. "Monica," Jack said, his voice tired. "What's going on?" "I just wanted to give you an update on Kayla's case," Monica said. "The guardianship paperwork is moving forward, but we still have a few hurdles to clear. I need to schedule another home visit, and there are a few more interviews we'll need to conduct before the process is finalized." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "How long will that take?" "A few more weeks at least," Monica replied, "but we're making progress." Jack nodded, though the thought of more waiting made his stomach churn. He wanted this to be over. He wanted to know for sure that Kayla was staying with him. "Monica," Jack said after a pause, "do you think I'm doing the right thing? Am I really what's best for her?" Monica was silent for a moment. "Sheriff, I've seen a lot of cases like Kayla's," she said softly, "and I've seen a lot of kids fall through the cracks, but I can tell that you care about her, and that's more than a lot of kids like Kayla get." Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "I don't want to let her down." "You won't," Monica said firmly. "Just keep doing what you're doing. Kayla's lucky to have you." Jack thanked her and hung up the phone, though the doubt still lingered in the back of his mind. Was he really enough for Kayla, or was he just delaying the inevitable? As the weeks went on, Jack and Kayla fell into a routine. She went to school during the day, and in the evenings they would sit together at the dinner table, talking about her day. At first, Kayla was quiet, answering his questions with one-word responses, but gradually she started opening up more. One night, as they sat together eating dinner, Kayla looked up at Jack and said, "Can I tell you something?" Jack set down his fork and nodded. "Of course." Kayla hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "It's about my mom." Jack's heart tightened. He had been careful not to press her about her past, knowing it was a sensitive topic. But now that she was ready to talk, he listened closely. "She wasn't always sick," Kayla began, her voice soft. "When we first came here, she was fine. We were fine. But then she started coughing a lot. She couldn't work anymore, and we lost our apartment." Jack listened, his chest aching as Kayla recounted her story. "We stayed in shelters for a while," Kayla continued, "but then she got really bad. One night she couldn't breathe, and they took her to the hospital. I stayed there with her, but she didn't wake up." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He could hear the pain in Kayla's voice, the way she was trying so hard to hold back her tears. "I didn't know what to do," Kayla whispered. "I was so scared." Jack reached out and gently took her hand. "I'm so sorry, Kayla. That must have been so hard for you." Kayla nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't want anyone to know. I thought if they found out they'd take me away. So I just stayed away from everyone." Jack's heart broke for her. She had been carrying this burden for so long, trying to survive on her own. No child should have to go through that. "You're not alone anymore," Jack said softly. "You don't have to carry this by yourself. I'm here for you." Kayla looked up at him, her eyes red and puffy. "Do you really mean that?" Jack nodded, his voice steady. "I mean it. You're safe here, Kayla." For a long moment, Kayla was silent, her small hand gripping Jack's. Then slowly she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Despite the progress they were making, Jack still found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling as doubts gnawed at him. He had taken on a huge responsibility, and while he cared deeply for Kayla, he couldn't help but wonder if he was really the right person for her. The legal process was dragging on longer than he had hoped, and with each passing day, the fear of losing Kayla grew stronger. What if the courts decided she would be better off somewhere else? What if someone else stepped in and took her away? One evening, Jack sat down with Monica Thompson to discuss the next steps in Kayla's case. "We're getting close, Sheriff," Monica said, flipping through a stack of papers. "But there are still some logistical issues we need to resolve before the guardianship is finalized." Jack frowned. "What?" "Well, for one thing, we need to ensure that you're fully prepared for the long-term responsibilities of caring for a child," Monica explained. "We'll need to schedule another home visit, and there will be a few more interviews." Jack nodded, though the thought of more scrutiny made him uneasy. What if they found something wrong? What if they decided he wasn't fit to be Kayla's guardian? "I understand," Jack said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I just want to make sure everything goes smoothly. Kayla's been through enough already." Monica smiled kindly. "I know. And from what I've seen, you're doing a great job. Just hang in there a little longer." Jack thanked her, but as he drove home that night, the doubts continued to swirl in his mind. He wanted to believe that everything would work out, that Kayla would be allowed to stay with him. But deep down, the fear of losing her gnawed at him, refusing to let go. A few days later, as Jack was getting ready for work, he noticed that Kayla had been unusually quiet. She barely touched her breakfast, and when he asked her if she was okay, she simply shrugged and said she wasn't hungry. Jack watched her carefully, his brow furrowing with concern. Something was bothering her, but she wouldn't tell him what it was. Later that afternoon, as Jack was finishing his shift, he received a call from the school. "Sheriff Wilkins, this is Mrs. Spencer, the school counselor. I'm calling about Kayla." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "Is something wrong?" "Well," Mrs. Spencer began, her voice hesitant, "Kayla had a bit of an outburst today. She got into an argument with another student and then locked herself in the bathroom. It took us a while to get her to come out." Jack frowned. "That doesn't sound like her. Did she say what was wrong?" "She wouldn't tell us much," Mrs. Spencer said. "But I think it might have something to do with her feeling insecure about her situation. She seems really worried about what's going to happen to her." Jack's chest tightened. Of course she's worried, he thought. She's been through so much already, and the uncertainty is eating her alive. "I'll talk to her," Jack said. "Thanks for letting me know." That evening, as Jack sat down with Kayla for dinner, he gently broached the topic. "Hey," he said softly, "I got a call from your school today. Mrs. Spencer told me about what happened." Kayla didn't look up from her plate. She just stared at the food, pushing it around with her fork. "Do you want to talk about it?" Jack asked, keeping his voice calm. For a long moment, Kayla didn't say anything. But then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, she said, "What if they take me away?" Jack's heart sank. He had known this fear was lurking in the back of her mind, but hearing her say it out loud was like a punch to the gut. "They're not going to take you away," Jack said firmly. "We're working on it, Kayla. We're almost there." "But what if they don't let me stay?" Kayla asked, her voice trembling. "What if they say you're not good enough?" Jack felt a lump form in his throat. What if she's right? "Kayla," Jack said softly, reaching out to take her hand. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you stay here. You belong here, with me." Kayla looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with uncertainty. "You really want me to stay?" Jack nodded, his voice steady. "More than anything." For the first time that evening, Kayla smiled. Just a small, tentative smile, but it was enough to give Jack hope. She whispered. As the days passed, Jack and Kayla continued to navigate their new life together. There were still moments of doubt and fear, but they were learning to trust each other more with each passing day. Jack had never imagined himself as a parent again, not after losing Emily. But with Kayla, he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for so long. One evening, as they sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the horizon, Kayla turned to Jack and said, "Do you think my mom would be happy?" Jack looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. "I think she'd be really proud of you, Kayla. You're brave and strong, and you've been through so much. I know she'd be happy that you're safe." Kayla smiled softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I think she would be too." Jack wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You've got a bright future ahead of you, Kayla, and I'm going to be right here with you, every step of the way." As they sat together, watching the last rays of sunlight fade into the night, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. He still had doubts, and there were still challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The weeks that followed were some of the most peaceful Jack had experienced in years. He and Kayla had settled into a comfortable routine, and with each passing day, she seemed to trust him more. Their mornings were filled with quiet breakfasts, their evenings with stories and the occasional game of checkers. Kayla had even started smiling more, the fear that once shadowed her every move slowly fading away. But even as things seemed to be going well, Jack couldn't shake the lingering worry about the finalization of the guardianship. The process was dragging on longer than expected, and every delay only deepened the gnawing sense of uncertainty that hung over them. One afternoon, as Jack sat in his office at the sheriff's station, Monica Thompson from Social Services called. "Sheriff Wilkins," Monica said, her voice steady, "I wanted to give you a heads up. We've had an unexpected development in Kayla's case." Jack's stomach dropped. "What kind of development?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Jack could almost hear Monica weighing her words carefully. "Kayla's biological father has come forward," Monica said finally. "He's claiming custody." Jack froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Kayla's father? He hadn't even known she had a father in the picture. "He wants custody?" Jack asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "Yes," Monica confirmed. "His name is Mark Jensen. He's filed for custody, and the courts are reviewing his claim." Jack's mind raced. Where had this man been all this time? Why was he only coming forward now? Kayla had never mentioned her father, and Jack had assumed he was either out of the picture or uninterested in her life. But now, after everything, this man wanted to take her away? "Does Kayla know about this?" Jack asked, his voice hardening. "Not yet," Monica said. "We wanted to speak with you first. I know this is a lot to take in, Sheriff, but we have to follow the legal process. Mark Jensen has a legitimate claim as her biological father, so we'll have to let the courts decide." Jack's chest tightened. The courts? The same system that could have let Kayla fall through the cracks, the same system that was dragging its feet on the guardianship process. He couldn't trust them to do what was right for Kayla, not after everything she had been through. "Monica, this man hasn't been in Kayla's life at all," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. "He abandoned her and her mother. How can he just come back now and claim custody?" "I understand your concerns," Monica said softly, "but the law is the law. We'll need to investigate his claim, and the judge will ultimately decide what's best for Kayla." Jack gripped the phone tighter, his mind swirling with anger and fear. I can't let this happen, Monica. Kayla's been through enough. She finally feels safe here. I know, Sheriff, Monica said gently, but we have to let the process play out. I'll do everything I can to advocate for Kayla's best interests, but we need to be prepared for all outcomes. Jack hung up the phone, his hands trembling. This couldn't be happening. Just when things were starting to settle, when Kayla was beginning to trust him, her entire world was being threatened again. He had to protect her. He couldn't lose her now. Jack spent the rest of the afternoon pacing the floor of his office, trying to figure out how to break the news to Kayla. How could he tell her that the father she had never known was suddenly back in the picture, wanting to take her away? When he finally returned home, Kayla was sitting on the porch, her school book spread out on the small table in front of her. She looked up when she saw him, her face lighting up with a smile. "Hey," she said, closing her book. "How was work?" Jack forced a smile, though his heart was heavy with the weight of what he had to say. "It was fine," he replied, sitting down beside her, "but we need to talk about something important." Kayla's smile faded, and she immediately tensed, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What's wrong?" Jack took a deep breath, bracing himself. "Kayla, I got a call today from social services. Your father, he's come forward. He's filed for custody." Kayla stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, she didn't say anything, as if she couldn't quite process what she had just heard. "My father?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wants me?" Jack nodded, his chest tight. "Yes, he's claiming custody, and the courts are going to review his case." Kayla shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. But he wasn't there. He never wanted me before. Why does he want me now?" "I don't know," Jack said softly. "But I promise you, we're going to fight this. You're safe here, and I'm not going to let them take you away without a fight." Kayla's hands trembled as she wiped away the tears that had begun to fall. "I don't want to go with him," she whispered. "I don't even know him." Jack's heart ached at the fear and confusion in her voice. He had known this would be hard, but seeing Kayla so distraught was breaking him inside. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Jack said gently. "We're going to get through this together. I won't let you go through this alone." Kayla looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. "What if they make me go with him? What if they say you can't keep me?" Jack clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "We'll figure something out. I'm not giving up on you, Kayla. Not ever." A week later, Jack received another call from Monica Thompson, informing him that Mark Jensen wanted to meet Kayla. Jack's first instinct was to refuse, to protect Kayla from this man who had abandoned her. But he knew that if he wanted any chance of keeping her, he had to play by the rules. The meeting was scheduled to take place at the social services office, with both Jack and Monica present to oversee the interaction. Jack dreaded the moment, but he knew Kayla needed to see the man who was trying to claim her, even if it filled her with fear and confusion. On the day of the meeting, Jack drove Kayla to the social services office, his heart pounding in his chest. Kayla sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands gripping the strap of her backpack tightly. She hadn't said much since they left the house, and Jack could tell she was trying to hold back her emotions. When they arrived at the office, Monica greeted them in the lobby, her expression sympathetic but professional. "Kayla, Sheriff," she said, giving them both a reassuring nod. "Are you ready?" Kayla glanced at Jack, her eyes wide with anxiety. Jack gave her a small nod of encouragement, though his own nerves were on edge. "We're ready," Jack said, his voice steady. Monica led them to a small conference room where Mark Jensen was waiting. Jack's eyes immediately went to the man sitting at the table, a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a hard expression. There was something cold in his eyes, something that made Jack's stomach churn. Mark stood as they entered, his gaze shifting to Kayla. For a moment, there was an awkward silence, and Jack could feel Kayla shrinking beside him, her small frame tense with fear. "Kayla," Mark said, his voice gruff, "it's good to see you." Kayla didn't respond. She just stared at him, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Jack wanted to step in, to shield Kayla from the tension in the room, but he knew he had to let this play out. Mark cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I know this is a lot for you," he said awkwardly, "but I'm your father." and I want to make things right." Kayla's hands trembled as she looked down at the floor, her voice barely audible. "Where were you?" she whispered. Mark hesitated, his face hardening. "It's complicated," he said, his voice defensive. "But I'm here now, and I want to take care of you." Kayla shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You weren't there when we needed you," she said, her voice cracking. "Why are you here now?" Mark's expression tightened, and Jack could see the frustration building in his eyes. "I didn't know how to handle things back then," Mark said, his tone sharp. "But I'm trying to make up for it." Jack's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the anger rising in his chest. This man had abandoned Kayla and her mother, and now he was trying to swoop in and claim her as if that could erase everything. Kayla wiped her eyes, her voice trembling. "I don't want to go with you." Mark's face hardened, but before he could respond, Monica stepped in. "Let's take a step back," Monica said calmly. "This is a difficult situation for everyone involved, and we need to give Kayla space to process everything." Jack felt a surge of gratitude for Monica. She was trying to diffuse the tension, but the damage had already been done. In the weeks that followed, the legal battle over Kayla's custody intensified. Jack's guardianship was still pending, and Mark Jensen was aggressively pursuing full custody, arguing that as her biological father, he had the right to raise her. The court hearings were emotionally exhausting, with both sides presenting their case. Mark painted a picture of a man who had made mistakes but wanted to make amends, while Jack fought to prove that Kayla was thriving in his care and that uprooting her would cause irreparable harm. Each day in court was a roller coaster of emotions. Kayla was forced to sit through hearings that discussed her future as if she were an object to be passed back and forth, and Jack could see the toll it was taking on her. She became quieter, more withdrawn, the weight of the uncertainty pressing down on her fragile heart. Jack's own fears grew with each passing day. What if the judge sided with Mark? What if they decided that biology outweighed the bond he had built with Kayla? The thought of losing her now, after everything they had been through, was unbearable. But through it all, Jack held on to one thing: Kayla's trust in him. Every night as they sat together at the dinner table, he would remind her that no matter what happened, he would fight for her. The final court hearing arrived, and with it came the decision that would determine Kayla's future. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation, as the judge listened to the closing arguments from both sides. Mark Jensen sat at the plaintiff's table, his expression hard and determined. Jack sat beside Kayla, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done everything he could, but now it was out of his hands. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "Before I make my final ruling, I want to hear from Kayla," the judge said, her gaze shifting to the small girl sitting beside Jack. "Kayla, I know this is difficult for you, but I'd like to know how you feel. What do you want to happen?" Kayla froze, her small hands trembling in her lap. Jack could see the fear in her eyes, the way she was struggling to find her voice. He leaned down and whispered softly in her ear. "It's okay," he said gently. "You can tell them how you feel. Whatever you say, I'm here for you." Kayla took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with tears. Slowly she stood up, her gaze shifting between the judge and her father. "I don't know my dad," she said softly, her voice trembling. "He wasn't there when we needed him. He didn't help my mom, and I don't want to go with him." Mark's face tightened, but he didn't say anything. Kayla turned to Jack, her eyes filled with emotion. "Sheriff Jack, he's taken care of me. He made me feel safe when I didn't have anyone, and I want to stay with him." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Kayla's words hanging in the air. The judge nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Kayla. I understand this has been difficult for you." As Kayla sat back down beside Jack, he gave her a small, reassuring smile, though his heart was racing. Had it been enough? Would the judge listen to her? After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally delivered her verdict. "After reviewing all the evidence and considering Kayla's wishes, I am ruling in favor of Sheriff Jack Wilkins," the judge said. "Temporary guardianship will be granted, with the possibility of adoption pending further review." The relief that washed over Jack was overwhelming. He could barely believe what he had just heard. Kayla was staying with him. The weeks that followed were filled with both relief and joy. With the court's ruling in his favor, Jack's guardianship of Kayla was now official. The possibility of adoption was on the horizon, and for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like they could finally move forward. Kayla was happier, more relaxed, knowing that she didn't have to worry about being taken away. The fear that had haunted her for so long was beginning to fade, replaced by a growing sense of security and belonging. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, Kayla turned to Jack and said, "Thank you." Jack looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. "For what?" "For fighting for me," Kayla said softly. "For not giving up." Jack smiled, his chest tight with pride and love. "I told you I wouldn't," he said. "You're stuck with me now, kiddo." Kayla grinned, her eyes bright with happiness. "Good." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jack felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He had fought for Kayla, and together they had won. And now they had a future to look forward to, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of a new beginning. In the months following the court ruling, Jack and Kayla's bond continued to deepen. The possibility of adoption was now in sight, and for the first time they began to plan for a future together as a permanent family. But the process of adoption was long and complex. Jack knew there were still legal hoops to jump through, and while they had won the guardianship battle, the adoption required more scrutiny. He was willing to do whatever it took, but he couldn't help but feel the pressure mounting as every meeting, home visit, and document became another hurdle to overcome. One afternoon, Monica Thompson visited Jack's home for yet another round of interviews. Kayla sat quietly in the living room, her face serious but calm, as Monica went through the necessary questions about her well-being. "How have things been at school, Kayla?" Monica asked gently. Kayla looked at Jack for reassurance, and he gave her a small nod. "They've been okay," Kayla said softly. "I like my teacher, and I'm making more friends." Monica smiled, jotting down notes. "That's wonderful to hear. And how do you feel about staying with Sheriff Jack?" Kayla glanced at Jack again before answering. "I feel safe and happy." Jack's heart swelled at her words. He hadn't realized how much her approval meant to him until that moment. Monica continued with her questions, and Jack could feel the weight of each one. This was the final stretch, and every word felt like a step closer, or further away, from making Kayla a permanent part of his life. When the interview was over, Monica gave them both a warm smile. "You're doing great, both of you," she said, standing to leave. "I'll be in touch about the next steps." As she walked out the door, Jack felt a mix of relief and anxiety. They were so close, but the uncertainty still gnawed at him. What if something went wrong? What if the system found a reason to deny the adoption? That night, as he and Kayla sat together on the porch, the weight of the process began to press down on Jack. "Are you okay?" Kayla asked, her voice soft. Jack forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." Kayla looked up at him, her eyes filled with concern. "You're worried about the adoption, aren't you?" Jack hesitated, not wanting to burden her with his fears. But he knew he couldn't hide his emotions from her. She had grown so much, and they had become so close. "A little," Jack admitted. "I just want everything to go smoothly. I want you to stay with me, Kayla. For good." Kayla reached out and took his hand, her small fingers squeezing his tightly. "I want to stay with you too," she whispered. "No matter what happens, we'll be okay. Right?" Jack nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Kiddo, we'll be okay." As the adoption process moved forward, something began to shift in Kayla. She became quieter, more introspective, and Jack noticed her withdrawing a bit from their usual routines. It worried him, but he didn't want to push her too hard. One evening, after dinner, Jack found Kayla sitting on the porch, staring out at the sunset with a distant look in her eyes. "Everything okay?" Jack asked, sitting down beside her. Kayla didn't answer right away. She just kept staring at the sky, her hands resting in her lap. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "I've been thinking about my mom a lot lately," she said softly. Jack's heart tightened. He knew that talking about her mother was always difficult for Kayla, but he also knew it was important for her to process those feelings. "It's normal to miss her," Jack said gently. "She was a big part of your life." Kayla nodded. her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I keep thinking, what would she say if she knew I was here? If she knew I was going to be adopted? Jack swallowed the lump in his throat. I think she'd be proud of you, he said quietly. And I think she'd be happy to know that you're safe and loved. Kayla wiped her eyes, her voice trembling. I wish she were here. I wish I could tell her everything. Jack reached out and pulled Kayla into a gentle hug, holding her close as she cried softly against his chest. You can still talk to her, Jack whispered. She may not be here, but you can still tell her how you feel. Kayla looked up at him, her eyes filled with sadness. Do you think she knows? Jack smiled gently. I think she does. For a long time, they sat there in silence, the weight of the past hanging between them. But in that moment, Jack realized something. They weren't just waiting for the future. They were learning to live with their pasts, together. As the adoption process neared its final stages, Jack received an unexpected phone call from Monica Thompson. Sheriff Wilkins, I wanted to let you know about a small complication that's come up, Monica said, her voice calm but cautious. Jack's stomach dropped. What kind of complication? There's been a last-minute inquiry from a relative of Kayla's on her mother's side, Monica explained. A distant cousin who is expressing interest in taking custody. Jack's heart sank. A relative? Now? After all this time? Why are we only hearing about this now? Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. They weren't aware of Kayla's situation until recently, Monica said. It's not uncommon for relatives to come forward late in the process. The courts will need to consider their claim, but I want to assure you that we're going to advocate for Kayla's best interests. Jack clenched his fists, a surge of frustration washing over him. They were so close. How could this happen now? What are the chances that this relative could actually get custody? Jack asked, his voice tight. It's hard to say, Monica admitted. It will depend on a number of factors, including their ability to provide for Kayla and the strength of your bond with her. We'll present your case, and the judge will make the final decision. Jack thanked Monica and hung up the phone, his mind racing. How could everything be threatened now, just when they were about to become a family? When he told Kayla about the potential complication, her reaction was immediate. I don't want to go with them, she said, her voice trembling with fear. I don't even know them. Jack knelt beside her, his heart aching at the fear in her eyes. I know, Kayla, and we're going to fight this. But you need to be strong, okay? We've been through a lot, and we're not giving up now. Kayla nodded, though the uncertainty lingered in her gaze. Jack wished he could give her more reassurance. But the truth was, he didn't know what the courts would decide. All he could do was keep fighting. The day of the final adoption hearing arrived, and Jack felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The courtroom was filled with the familiar faces of lawyers, social workers, and the judge. But it was the presence of Kayla's distant relative that unnerved him the most. The relative, Margaret Turner, sat at the plaintiff's table, her expression calm but determined. She was a middle-aged woman, well-dressed and poised, and as much as Jack hated to admit it, she seemed capable and well-intentioned. But that didn't change the fact that she had been absent from Kayla's life up until now. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about Kayla's best interests. It was about family ties and legal obligations. The hearing began with each side presenting their case. Margaret spoke of her desire to reconnect with her late cousin's child, to provide Kayla with a sense of family and heritage that she believed was important. But when it was Jack's turn to speak, he poured his heart out. He talked about the bond he had formed with Kayla, about the progress she had made since coming into his care, and about the deep love and commitment he had for her. She's not just a child in need of a home, Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. She's my family now, and I'm hers. We've built a life together, and I want to give her the stability, love, and future she deserves. Kayla was called to the stand, just as she had been during the custody battle with her father. She stood before the judge, her small frame dwarfed by the large courtroom, but there was a quiet strength in her voice. I want to stay with Sheriff Jack, Kayla said firmly. He's the one who's been there for me. He's the one who made me feel safe, and I love him. Tears welled up in Jack's eyes as he listened to her speak. He knew how much courage it took for Kayla to stand up for herself, and in that moment, he was more proud of her than he had ever been. The judge listened carefully to both sides, and after what felt like an eternity, she delivered her final ruling. After reviewing all the evidence and considering the best interests of the child, I am ruling in favor of Sheriff Jack Wilkins, the judge said. The adoption is hereby approved. The relief that washed over Jack was overwhelming. He felt like he could finally breathe again. Kayla was officially his daughter. The days that followed the adoption ruling were filled with celebration and joy. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of peace and happiness that he hadn't known since before Emily and Laura's deaths. Kayla was his daughter, and they were a family, officially and forever. They threw a small party to celebrate, inviting a few close friends and neighbors who had supported them throughout the process. Kayla beamed with happiness as she showed off her new room, which they had decorated together with bright yellow walls, her favorite color. But it wasn't just about the party or the legal paperwork. It was about the small moments they shared every day. The laughter at the dinner table, the quiet talks before bed, the way Kayla would call him Dad now with confidence and pride. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Kayla turned to Jack and said, "Do you think Emily would have liked me?" Jack smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "I think she would have loved you." Kayla grinned, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "I think I would have liked her too." As the sun set over the horizon, casting a warm golden light over them, Jack felt a deep sense of gratitude. The journey they had been on had been long and difficult, filled with heartbreak and uncertainty. But in the end, they had found each other. They had built a family together. And as they sat there, side by side, watching the world slowly fade into night, Jack knew that this was just the beginning of their story. Together, they would face whatever came next, because they were a family now. As the weeks turned into months, Jack and Kayla settled into their new life together. The weight of uncertainty had lifted, and in its place was a sense of hope and stability that neither of them had known for a long time. Kayla was thriving at school, making friends, and excelling in her classes. She had even joined the school's art club, where she spent hours creating beautiful paintings and drawings, something that Jack loved seeing. Her creativity and spirit were blossoming, and Jack couldn't have been prouder. One Saturday morning, as they sat at the kitchen table eating pancakes, part of their weekly tradition, Kayla looked up at Jack and asked, "Do you think we'll ever stop having to fight for things?" Jack paused, considering her question. It was true. They had fought so hard to get where they were. But now, with the adoption finalized and their future secure, he felt like they had finally won the battle. "I think we've done our share of fighting," Jack said, smiling. "Now it's time to enjoy life. Together." Kayla smiled back, a look of contentment settling over her. "I like that." As they finished their breakfast, Jack felt a deep sense of peace. They had been through so much, but they had come out stronger on the other side. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had brought them together in a way that nothing else could. And now, with the future wide open before them, Jack knew that whatever challenges came their way, they would face them as a family. Because in the end, it wasn't just about the fight. It was about the love that had grown between them, the love that had made them a family, and that was something no one could ever take away. As the months passed, Jack and Kayla continued to grow together, their bond strengthening with each day. Their lives had found a new rhythm, one filled with moments of joy, laughter, and the simple happiness that came from knowing they were no longer alone. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars appear in the sky, Kayla turned to Jack with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about how everything would be different if you hadn't found me that night?" she asked softly. Jack looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. He thought back to that fateful night at the laundromat, when he had first seen the small, frightened girl sitting all alone. It seemed like a lifetime ago now, but in many ways, it was the moment that changed both of their lives forever. "I think about it all the time," Jack admitted, "and every day I'm grateful that I did find you." Kayla smiled, leaning her head against Jack's shoulder. "Me too. I never thought I'd have a family again." "You'll always have a family," Jack said firmly, "no matter what happens." Kayla's smile widened, her eyes shining with happiness. They had come so far from those lonely, uncertain days, and now they had a future full of love and hope ahead of them. As the stars twinkled above them, Jack knew that their journey had only just begun. There would be challenges ahead, but they would face them together, as a family. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of love, hope, and the power of family. Jack and Kayla's story reminds us that, even in our darkest moments, we can find light and connection with others. And sometimes it's the people we least expect who become our greatest source of strength. If this story touched your heart and you want to hear more inspiring tales like Jack and Kayla's, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our community. We share stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit, the bonds that unite us, and the power of second chances. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. We've got more heartwarming stories coming your way that you won't want to miss. Click here to subscribe now and be part of our journey. And if you know someone who could use a little inspiration, feel free to share this story with them. After all, we could all use a reminder that love, in all its forms, can heal even the deepest wounds.